when we see this dramatic ideological and methodological change that's occurring in the worldview of the scholastics moving into the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution, it helps to inform us and to help us to understand what Descartes is really trying to do. And so when we look at that first meditation, when we look at the very first paragraph, Descartes articulates the first project of the meditations, the negative project. And he tells his readers, I accepted many falsehoods as true in my youth, that what I built upon the foundation of these falsehoods was dubious, and therefore that once in my life I would need to tear down everything and begin anew from the foundations if I wanted to establish a firm and lasting knowledge. So Descartes articulates this first project, a destructive project. He's going to tear down his belief edifice. And why is he doing that? Well, in part, what he's trying to do is push back against what he perceives as the rigid dogmatism of scholasticism to make way for what he sees as the modern progressive scientific revolution ideas. And so he's not just tearing things down in his own belief edifice. What he's encouraging people to do is to step back and re-examine their presuppositions about the nature of the world, about methodology, about all of the things that they learned when they were in university. Now, how is Descartes going to do that? How is he going to push down on this? Well, he's going to engage in a negative epistemic project. He's going to undermine the foundations of all his knowledge. He's going to make a skeptical argument, or several really, that he hopes will destroy the epistemic basis, the warrant or justification for all of the judgments that he's made before now, so that there is nothing left. And in doing so, he will be metaphorically encouraging us to do the same thing, at least to carefully re-examine our worldviews, our knowledge edifice. And so we remind ourselves, right, that means that there's this significant epistemic component in the meditations, which is primarily what we're focusing on. And the epistemological component is going to be very much what we recognize from that first lecture, right? It's going to be the study of the nature, the sources, and the extent of knowledge. It's going to ask questions like, well, what is knowledge? How does one get knowledge? What, if any, connection or structure exists within bodies of knowledge? What can humans and others know? And what, maybe, can they not know? And these are all questions that we see either explicitly asked or implicitly asked throughout the meditations. And so Descartes' first project, his negative project, which he articulates and then executes within the first meditation, is the skeptical project. He's trying to undermine all of his knowledge, particularly all of his knowledge about the external world. And recall, skepticism is the thesis that someone or anyone does not have knowledge with regard to some area. So you could have skepticism with regard to politics. You could have skepticism with regard to economics. But what Descartes wants is this really global skepticism, the skepticism about everything we know about the external world. And so external world skepticism differs from more modest skeptical hypotheses in that it denies all of our knowledge about the external world. And this is the external world skeptical hypothesis that Descartes executes and describes in his first meditation. And it's supposed to clear the way for his second positive project, where he takes his epistemic framework and he tries to rebuild his knowledge structure so that it accords with his epistemic framework. Now, let's finish this lecture module with a couple of cautionary notes. We have to be careful, just as with Plato, when we're thinking about Descartes, because there'll be this temptation, inevitably, to lapse into thinking about Descartes' project on our contemporary terms, to project our understanding of his project onto him. And this really is a bad idea if we want to appreciate what Descartes is doing. And so we'll have to at least remind ourselves as we go through the difference between the contemporary understanding and the traditional or the Cartesian understanding. So the most common contemporary theory of knowledge, as I mentioned in the last Plato lectures, equates knowledge with justified true belief, having true belief with some reason to suppose that it's really distinguishable from just something that you accidentally believed and happened to be true. And this contemporary theory of knowledge, as we noted when we read the Theaetetus, it has precursors in work dating all the way back to ancient Greek, and this certainly has precursors in Descartes himself. But they did not really think about epistemology in quite the same way that we do. So Descartes doesn't really talk about justification per se, and he doesn't have an ontology of beliefs. So when we talk about justified true belief, we're implicitly projecting a belief desire psychology, using that as an ontological framework for our epistemic theories and ruminations. But Descartes doesn't have that view. And we need to be careful about this when we're focusing on what it is that Descartes is thinking and what it is that he's doing and how his theory actually works on his terms. So his view focuses on judgments. So the psychological operations that are important are episodes of judging things. And what is he judging? What is the mental ontology that's most important for Descartes? Well, it's not beliefs, it's ideas. And you might say, well, an idea is just like a belief, but it really isn't. We normally contemporarily construe beliefs as being propositional. Beliefs that have a content that can be described using a sentence that is a proposition, has a truth value. But not all ideas seem to be subject to this. One of the major metaphors of ideas for Descartes and for other people of his time was an image. And an image doesn't have a truth value, and it isn't propositional. And so we want to keep that in mind. He's talking about judgments about ideas, and he does focus a lot on the individual judgments about individual sensations, even though he will put them in this larger context, put them in his overall knowledge structure, his worldview. And so in doing so, he'll be taking into account worldviews, in part because he's worried about or thinking about or trying to facilitate a changeover or an adjustment of worldviews. So when we look at Descartes, one of the things we'll notice is the Latin word for belief, fides. It does not figure in his characterization of the project anywhere in the Meditations. So his project really is an epistemology of judgments, and it's an epistemology of judgments about ideas. Now there's one more note of caution that we ought to adopt here. So most epistemologists, contemporary epistemologists, whether they are consciously aware of it or not, are probably what we would call a doxastic voluntarist. So doxastic is of or about beliefs. And so a doxastic voluntarist thinks that given some bit of evidence, you can have some voluntary component as to whether or not you will believe something on the basis of that evidence or not. A doxastic involuntarist holds the antithesis of that view. He holds or she holds that given some bit of evidence, it either compels you to form a belief or it doesn't. So there is no voluntary component to belief formation. Now, most contemporary epistemologists are probably implicit voluntarists. What about Descartes? Well, Descartes is quite different. Descartes is an involuntarist for cases of perfect certainty and uncertainty, and a voluntarist for the areas in between. So for Descartes, certainty compels assent. If you have a rational intuition, like 2 + 2 = 4, that compels your assent because you cannot doubt it. There's no way for you to understand it as being false, and hence you are compelled to assent to that judgment. And presumably, if there's something that's just completely uncertain, that has a 0 probability, you would be compelled to withhold your judgment from, or your assent from that judgment as well. Now, in between that extreme, utter uncertainty and utter certainty, there are all these other subjective levels of confidence. All right? And for Descartes, those are areas where there is a voluntary component. So anywhere in between certainty and uncertainty, the volition, the will, is exercised to assent from or withhold assent from a particular belief. But on the extremes, not. So we'll pick this up in our next lecture module.